So you're wanting to get into lawn bowls, or you've just started and you hear everyone talking about one thing: bias. So what actually is bias? Well, this video is going to break down everything you need to know and how it can also change almost every single decision in your lawn bowls career. Before we begin, if you haven't already, please do make sure that you subscribe to the channel to keep up to date on all of my videos on lawn bowls in the future. So what is bias? Well, a common misconception is that each bowl has a weight in one side and that heavier side causes it to turn. The actual reason is due to a very small offset in mass provided by the manufacturer. A bowl isn't a perfect circle and one side has slightly more mass than the other. This offsets the centre of gravity, which causes the bowl to turn as it starts to slow down. Now the offset is very small and only ranges from about 0.7 to 0.9 millimeters. Manufacturers can affect almost every single detail when it comes to the bias. They can adjust the overall strength of the bias, they can adjust how much it turns when it starts to slow down, and they can even adjust if it has a hook on the end of the travel or if it's a much more linear line. It's amazing what can be achieved by a simple bias adjustment. Now it's important to note that while there are lots of different delivery styles when it comes to lawn bowls, the bowl does all of the work when it comes to the turn. So now that you know what bias is, how do you tell which side the bias is on? Now it would be silly each time to hold the bowl up to your face to tell which side is slightly shallower than the other. It's almost impossible to tell and it's really difficult, especially when you're playing a game. Each bowl has a side with a large circle and a large logo and a small circle with a small logo. Now the bias is always on the smaller circle side. That is an industry standard and it does not change. Now another way to tell is the stamp on each bowl. Every bowl has to go through a certification procedure to make sure that it can be used in a competitive game. Now that stamp is always going to be on the small circle side. Now most people tend to use stickers. You'll have a larger sticker and a smaller sticker as well. As we've said before, the small circle with the small sticker is the side that the bias is on. So now we know how the bowl turns and how we can identify which side the bias is on, we need to know what bias is right for you. You have a few main manufacturers within the industry and they make entire ranges of bowls to vary for different players. Now this makes sense as to why they do that, because it attracts more people if they have a much wider range because of all the different play styles and the different preferences that people have. We're going to touch on each of these points more individually, but some of the main factors to consider when it comes to choosing what bias is right for you is if you're going to be playing indoor, outdoor or both, whether you're going to be playing at the front end or the back end, and also the weight of those greens, both indoors and outdoors. Now depending if you're going to be playing indoors or outdoors or even both, this does have an effect on the type of bias that would be best suited to you. A really safe option would be what's called a mid-bias bowl. Now in short, all that means is it doesn't play really narrow, but it doesn't swing really wide either. It plays in the middle. At the moment, I'm playing with Taylor Vector VS's. They provide a nice balance for me and it allows me to play both indoor and outdoor if I want to. Now there is a huge variety of mid-bias bowls across the different major brands, so make sure you do your research and find what would be best suited to you. If you are already playing, let me know what you're currently playing with in the comments below. Now if we were to swap round and say that you predominantly play outdoors or maybe with a really slow heavy indoor green, what you're going to need to look for is a slightly wider bias bowl. Now the heavy bias bowl is going to swing more, and the heavier the green, the more it's going to swing, which is why you need a heavier bias bowl to compensate for the green itself. A couple of examples of what you would consider a narrow bias bowl for indoors would be something like Drake's Pride D-Tex or Taylor Lasers. And some more mid-bias examples that can be used both indoor and outdoor would be something along the lines of the Taylor Vector VS, Drake's Pride Professionals or the Taylor Ace. So now that we've dived into if you're going to be playing indoor or outdoor, or if you're going to be tackling both throughout the year, we now need to focus on where you're going to play. This can be a really complex subject, and what we're going to do is focus on if you're in a team of 4. If you play something like singles, it's going to be a little bit more complex because you do a bit of everything. You have to do some fire shots, you have to do some weighted shots, and you have to do some standard draw shots. But generally in a team of 4, what you have is what's called the front end, which is your lead and number 2, and you have the back end, which is your number 3 or skip. The front end of the team tend to just play a drawing game, getting bowls as close to the jack as possible with very little in the way of obstacles, short bowls, or anything like that. If you do get something like an obstacle of a short bowl that's actually in the way, chances are you can simply switch the hand and then draw the other side. So you can get away with using a slightly more mid to narrow bias bowl to reduce the risk of potentially being penalised more if you draw it slightly narrow. That is also something to note as well. The narrower the bias of the bowl, the less you're going to be penalised if you bowl it slightly too narrow. If you have a really aggressive bias bowl, if you do bowl it too narrow, it's going to hook around really tight and you're going to be miles away from the jack where you're trying to bowl. Now, if you're playing at the back end, either number 3 or skip, the game changes quite drastically for you. You're going to need a heavier bias bowl to navigate around potential obstacles, or you might need to do a simple draw shot that someone with a narrower bias bowl simply wouldn't be able to do. You're going to need that additional flexibility to be able to make these different shots depending on how the head is in that particular end. Now, something like an Aero Groove can provide that additional flexibility because it's a heavier bias bowl, whereas something like a Drake's Pride D-Tech wouldn't be able to provide that additional flexibility because it's a really narrow bias. Now, if you're just starting out or you've only played for a year or so, chances are you're going to be playing at the front end. Now, while this isn't as big of a factor, the weight of the greens that you're going to be playing on does have an effect as well. The heavier the green, the more it's going to swing. So if you play on a really slow and heavy indoor green, then consider using a slightly more mid to wide bias bowl. The same applies for outdoor greens as well, and you can even reverse it. If you're playing with a really fast green, then you can afford to use a slightly more mid to narrow bias bowl because you don't need that additional swing for the heavier green. As mentioned earlier, there are lots of exceptions to this rule. So if you find something that you're comfortable with, the best thing to do is to continue to practice and work with it. And if you're still not sure, feel free to speak with other members of your club so they can provide some advice for you. So there we go, everything you need to know about bias when it comes to lawn bowls. If you think I've missed anything, please let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching. As I said, if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to my channel to keep up to date on all of my videos in the future. But until next time everyone, as always, take care, stay safe, we'll see you in the next one.